I never thought one choice could change everything. My name's Tyson Carter, and I've spent my life fighting to keep my head above water. When I saved a stranger, I didn't expect anything in return, except maybe a second chance for my mom. Now, my world's turned upside down with opportunities one never dreamed of. This is my story, of struggle, hope, and finding out just how far one act of kindness can go. Based on a true story. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The buzzing of my alarm clock yanked me out of a restless sleep. I slapped the snooze button, but the buzzing didn't stop, not really. It lingered in the back of my mind, echoing with all the things I couldn't ignore. My eyes drifted to the kitchen table where the eviction notice sat, its red letters glaring back at me like an unspoken challenge. Pay up or get out, it seemed to sneer. I hated it. But hating it wouldn't change anything. Mom was already gone by the time I swung my legs out of bed, the creak of the mattress reminding me of how old it was, how old everything in this apartment was. She must have left at the crack of dawn for her shift at the diner. She always worked early, hoping to catch the breakfast crowd. It meant more tips, but it also meant more exhaustion. I glanced at the clock. If I didn't leave soon, I'd be late for school. Not that it mattered much. School was just a place I went because I had to, not because it promised anything. Not for someone like me. I threw on my cleanest shirt, even though it still had a faint stain on the hem, grabbed my beat-up backpack, and headed out. Outside, the air smelled of car exhaust and something faintly metallic. Our neighborhood always smelled like that, a mix of neglect and survival. I took the long way to school, cutting through the fancy part of town. I told myself it was for the fresh air, but really, it was for the buildings. The kind you see in movies, tall, gleaming, untouchable. The kind of places that made you think, what if? My sneakers slapped against the pavement as I walked past the Collins Enterprise building, its glass walls shining in the morning sun. I glanced up at it, imagining what it must feel like to step inside, to belong in a place like that. But then my stomach growled, and the reality of my own life yanked me back down. I didn't have time to dream. Not with an eviction notice hanging over my head. By the time I got to school, the halls were already filling up with noise. Kids laughed and shouted, their voices bouncing off the chipped walls. None of them had to worry about eviction notices. None of them had to see their moms work themselves into the ground just to keep the lights on. I slipped into class just as the bell rang, dropping into my seat in the back corner. The teacher droned on about something, I wasn't listening. My mind was still back at the apartment, thinking about how much longer we had before the landlord came knocking. I didn't know it then, but that was the day everything would change. That was the day I'd find myself standing at a crossroads, faced with a choice that would alter the course of my life. But at that moment, I was just a kid trying to get through another day, the weight of the world pressing down on my shoulders. The walk home from school always felt longer than the walk there, like every step was weighed down by the same questions I couldn't answer. How long did we have before the landlord decided to kick us out? How much longer could Mom keep pushing herself before she broke? The answers didn't come, just like they never did. I'd taken my usual route through the wealthier part of town. The air seemed fresher here, cleaner somehow, and the streets were lined with those huge oak trees that dropped golden leaves in the fall. Everything about this neighborhood whispered, you don't belong here. I kept my head down, walking quickly past Collins Enterprise, the tallest and shiniest building in the area. The glass walls reflected the sunlight so brightly it hurt to look at them. I passed by it every day, but I never really looked at it. Not until today. That's when I saw her. She was standing near the curb, her hand pressed against her belly, her face pale and sweaty. She swayed on her feet like she was about to collapse. I froze. For a second, I told myself someone else would help her. There were dozens of people passing by, all of them dressed in suits, their shoes clicking against the pavement. Somebody else had to notice. But no one stopped. A few people glanced at her, their faces flickering with brief concern before they kept walking. Too busy. Too important. I heard Mom's voice in my head, "Stay out of trouble, Tyson. Especially in places like this." But she also used to say, "Do the right thing, even if it's hard." My feet were moving before I could think about it anymore. "Hey! Are you okay?" I called out as I jogged toward her. She didn't answer. Her knees buckled, and she started to fall. I barely caught her in time, my arms wrapping around her shoulders as she sank to the ground. She was breathing fast, shallow, like she couldn't get enough air. "It's okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've got you. Just hang on." I glanced around, hoping someone would help, but people just stared. A man in a sharp suit gave me a look like I was doing something wrong, like I didn't belong there. Then I saw the security guard. He was coming toward us, his hand resting near the radio on his belt. His face was hard, his eyes suspicious. "What's going on here?" he barked. "She needs help." I snapped back, my voice cracking. The guard didn't stop. He kept coming closer, his eyes narrowing like I was a threat. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know what he was going to do, but I wasn't going to let go of her. Before the guard could say another word, a voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Let him through." The guard stopped in his tracks, his head snapping toward the voice. I turned too, and for the first time, I saw him, a tall man in a dark suit standing on the steps of Collins Enterprise. His face was tense, his eyes locked on the woman in my arms. He ran toward us, and as he got closer, I realized who he was. The way he knelt down beside her, the way he touched her shoulder, the way she whispered, "James," I didn't need anyone to tell me. This was her husband. The paramedics arrived in what felt like seconds, though I couldn't say for sure. Time had turned into a blur of faces, voices, and lights. I stepped back as they swarmed around the woman, Mrs. Collins, I learned from the murmurs around me, strapping her onto a stretcher and wheeling her toward the waiting ambulance. I stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to do. The tall man, James Collins, followed the paramedics to the ambulance, murmuring something to his wife that I couldn't hear. Then, to my surprise, he turned back to me. His eyes were sharp but not unkind, and they locked onto mine with a kind of intensity that made me want to shrink into the pavement. "You," he said, walking toward me. His voice was steady, but there was an edge of emotion in it. "What's your name?" "Tyson," I said quietly, my voice barely carrying over the hum of the ambulance's engine. "Tyson Carter." He stopped in front of me, his gaze softening. "Tyson Carter," he repeated, like he was committing it to memory. "You saved my wife. You might have saved my child, too." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, my hands fidgeting in the pockets of my jeans. "You didn't have to help her," he said. "You didn't have to do any of this." I shrugged, looking down at the scuffed toes of my sneakers. She needed help. It just felt like the right thing to do. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a sleek, silver business card. "Tyson, I owe you more than I can ever repay. Tell me, what can I do for you? Name it." The card sparkled in the sunlight, and my breath caught in my throat. My mind raced with possibilities. Money, a way to help my mom, something to get us out of that apartment. The words swirled in my head, jumbled and incoherent. But when I opened my mouth, none of those words came out. "My mom," I said. She needs a job. She works hard, but it's not enough. If you could help her, that's all I want." His eyebrows lifted, and for a moment, he looked almost stunned. He probably expected me to ask for money or something for myself. But the idea of asking for anything other than a chance for my mom felt wrong. Mr. Collins tucked the card back into his pocket and gave me a slow, deliberate nod. "Consider it done," he said. "Bring her to my office tomorrow morning. We'll make it happen." I didn't even know how to respond. Relief and disbelief washed over me in equal measure. "Thank you," I managed, my voice cracking. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm but kind. "No, Tyson. Thank you." As he turned to join his wife in the ambulance, I stood there, stunned, watching the vehicle disappear down the street. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, I felt something I hadn't dared to feel in a long time: hope. The next morning, the sunlight pouring through the cracked blinds felt brighter than usual, even though I knew nothing about our situation had changed. Not yet, at least. I sat at the kitchen table, trying to eat a bowl of cereal, but my stomach was too twisted to manage more than a few bites. Mom stood by the sink, tying her hair back with the same elastic band she used every day. Her uniform, an old button-up shirt and black pants, looked more tired than she did, and that was saying something. She caught me staring and raised an eyebrow. "What's got you looking so serious this morning, Ty?" she asked, turning to wipe her hands on a dish towel. I swallowed hard, the words bubbling up before I could think too much about them. "Mom, we're going downtown today. To Collins Enterprise." Her hands froze mid-motion. "Collins Enterprise? Tyson, what are you talking about?" I pushed the cereal bowl aside and stood up. "Yesterday, I helped someone. A woman. She was hurt, and her husband works at Collins Enterprise. He said he'd help. He said he could give you a job." Her laugh was short and humorless. "A job? Ty, that's not how the world works. People don't just hand out jobs because someone asks nicely." I shook my head, stepping closer. "This isn't like that, Mom. I didn't ask for charity. I asked for a chance. Please, just come with me. Let him explain." She stared at me for a long moment, her lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping. "All right. But don't get your hopes up, okay? I've been let down enough times to know better." We arrived at Collins Enterprise later that morning, and as soon as we stepped inside the lobby, I felt like we didn't belong. The marble floors gleamed so brightly I could almost see my reflection in them. Everyone walking by was dressed in sharp suits, their footsteps echoing in a rhythm that felt too fast for us to keep up with. Mom's hand tightened around the strap of her purse, her knuckles white. "I don't think we should be here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the space. Before I could answer, I spotted Mr. Collins across the room. He was talking to someone in a gray suit, but as soon as he saw us, he excused himself and walked over. "Tyson," he called out, his smile broad and warm. His eyes shifted to my mom, and he extended a hand. "You must be Mrs. Carter. I'm James Collins. It's a pleasure to meet you." Mom hesitated, her expression guarded, but she shook his hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but distant. "I don't know what my son told you, but—" He cut her off gently. "He told me you're looking for an opportunity. And I believe we might have something for you here. If you're willing to hear me out." Her eyes flicked to me, unsure, before returning to him. "I'm listening." Mr. Collins led us to his office, a massive space with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. He gestured for us to sit, then explained the role, a position on their building services team. It was steady work, he said, with benefits and a decent wage. Mom was quiet, her hands gripping the purse in her lap. "I don't want charity," she said finally, her voice firmer now. "If I take this job, it's because I earned it. I wouldn't expect anything less, Mr. Collins replied without missing a beat. This isn't charity, Mrs. Carter. It's a job. And I believe you'll do it well. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on all of us. Then, slowly, Mom nodded. All right, she said softly. I'll take it. Relief washed over me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't seen in months: hope. The buzz started the next day, though I didn't realize it at first. School was the same as always: crowded halls, scraped-up lockers, and teachers droning on about things that felt far removed from my world. I kept my head down, trying to blend in like I always did. But by lunchtime, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Yo, Tyson. Marcus's voice carried across the cafeteria, cutting through the usual chatter. I looked up to see him waving me over. He wasn't exactly a friend, more like someone who nodded at me in class now and then. What's up? I asked, sliding into the seat across from him. Marcus grinned, shoving his phone in my face. This. Dude, you're famous. The screen showed a picture of me crouched next to Mrs. Collins on the sidewalk. Someone must have snapped it during the chaos yesterday. The caption read, "Teen saves pregnant woman outside Collins Enterprise, local hero." My stomach flipped. What the heck? Where did you get this? It's all over social media, man. People are talking about it. You're like a real-life superhero or something. He leaned back, still grinning. You're the guy who did the right thing when no one else would. That's dope. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to crawl under the table and pretend this wasn't happening. The other part. I wasn't sure what the other part felt. Pride, maybe? No, that couldn't be it. It's not a big deal, I mumbled. I just helped someone. That's all. Marcus laughed, shaking his head. Whatever you say, man. But everyone thinks it's a big deal. That evening, the buzz followed me home. Mom was already back from her first day at Collins Enterprise when I walked in, her shoulders sagging from exhaustion but her eyes brighter than I'd seen them in weeks. How was it? I asked, dropping my backpack by the door. She smiled faintly. It was good. Honest work. They treated me well. She hesitated, then added, that Mr. Collins, he checked in on me a few times today. Made sure I was settling in. I didn't expect that. I nodded, a wave of relief washing over me. I'm glad. Her gaze lingered on me, and I could see the questions bubbling just below the surface. Finally, she asked, "And how was your day?" It was weird, I admitted. Someone posted a picture of me helping Mrs. Collins. Now people are talking about it, calling me a hero. Mom's brow furrowed, but then she reached over and placed a hand on my shoulder. You did a good thing, Tyson. It's okay to let people see that. The next day, things got even weirder. Just before I walked into class, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and stared at the caller ID. James Collins. Hello? I answered, stepping into the hallway. Tyson, his voice came through the line, calm and warm. How are you? I'm good, sir, I said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. How's Mrs. Collins? She's recovering well, thanks to you, he said. There was a pause, and then he continued. That's actually why I'm calling. I've spoken to a scholarship foundation I work with, and they're interested in meeting you. Would you be available later this week? My heart stopped for a moment. A scholarship foundation? That's right, he said. Your selflessness inspired me, Tyson. I think you deserve a chance to pursue something bigger, and this might be it. I didn't know what to say. A scholarship? For me? It sounded too good to be true. But when I glanced back into the classroom, at the desks and textbooks that suddenly felt like more than just tools to pass time, I realized I wanted it. "Yes, sir," I said, my voice steady. "I'll be there." I sat at the kitchen table, staring at a blank sheet of paper, the edges smudged from where my fingers had been gripping it too tightly. My pen hovered just above the surface, but nothing came. The words were stuck somewhere between my heart and my hand, refusing to spill out. "Write about your dreams, Mr. Collins had said when he called to explain the scholarship application. "They want to know what you hope for, what drives you." But that was the problem. What dreams? My whole life, dreams had been luxuries, things for kids who didn't have eviction notices pinned to their kitchen tables. My only hope was to make it to the next day without losing what little we had. How could I put that on paper and make it sound like a dream worth funding? Mom's voice pulled me out of my thoughts. "Ty. You've been sitting there for almost an hour. You okay?" She stood in the doorway, her hair tied back and her face soft with concern. She looked exhausted from her second day at Collins Enterprise, but there was something else in her expression, something lighter. "Hope. I don't know what to write," I admitted, setting the pen down. "I don't think I have anything worth saying." She frowned, walking over to sit across from me. "That's not true, Tyson. You've got plenty to say." I shook my head. "I don't have dreams, Mom. I've just been trying to survive." She reached across the table and rested her hand on mine. "Then write about that. Write about what we've been through. Write about how you helped Mrs. Collins, not because you had to, but because it was the right thing to do. Write about the kind of person you are, Ty. That's worth more than any dream." Her words settled in my chest, filling a space I hadn't realized was empty. I picked up the pen again and started writing. The words didn't flow easily, but they came. I wrote about Mom, about how hard she worked and how much she gave up for me. I wrote about the eviction notice, the constant weight of it pressing down on us. I wrote about Mrs. Collins, how scared she looked, and how something inside me told me I couldn't walk away. And then I wrote about hope. About what it would mean to have a chance to be more than my circumstances, to give back to the woman who had given me everything. By the time I finished, the page was covered in scribbled lines and crossed-out sentences, but it felt real. It felt like me. The day of the scholarship meeting arrived too quickly. I stood outside a gleaming office building downtown, clutching my essay in one hand and trying not to let my nerves show. Mr. Collins met me at the entrance, his suit crisp and his smile reassuring. "You ready?" he asked. I nodded, though my stomach was doing flips. "As ready as I'll ever be." He led me inside to a conference room where 3 people sat waiting, 2 women and a man, all of them dressed as sharply as Mr. Collins. They introduced themselves as representatives from the Scholarship Foundation, but I barely caught their names. My focus was on the essay in my hand and the lump in my throat. "Tyson," the man said, smiling warmly, "we've heard a lot about you. Why don't you tell us about yourself?" I hesitated, glancing at Mr. Collins. He gave me a small nod, and I took a deep breath. "My name is Tyson Carter," I began, my voice steady but quiet. "And this is my story." I told them everything. About Mom, the eviction notice, Mrs. Collins, and the essay I'd poured my heart into. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then the man leaned forward, his eyes kind. "Tyson," he said, "we'd be honored to award you this scholarship. You've earned it." Later that night, back at the kitchen table, Mom and I sat in stunned silence. The essay sat between us, and the weight of everything it had brought me was overwhelming. "You did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You really did it." For the first time, I let myself believe it. "We did it, Mom. We did it together." A few days later, I found myself walking past Collins Enterprise, my mind buzzing with thoughts about the scholarship, school, and everything that had changed so quickly. I barely noticed the figure standing by the building entrance until I heard a familiar voice. "Hey, kid." I turned, and my stomach tightened when I saw him, the security guard from that day. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, looking about as uncomfortable as I felt. For a second, I considered walking past him without stopping. But something in his expression made me pause. "Yes?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes darting away before meeting mine again. I just wanted to say I was wrong," he said, his voice gruff. "About that day. The way I came at you, like you were causing trouble. I shouldn't have assumed." I blinked, caught off guard by his words. He scratched the back of his head, still avoiding my gaze. "I've seen a lot of stuff around here, you know. People pulling scams, making trouble. I don't know. I thought you were one of them." His words hit me harder than I expected, not because they were surprising, but because they weren't. I'd spent my whole life being judged by people who saw the worst in me before they saw anything else. But this was the first time someone had admitted it. "I get it," I said finally, crossing my arms. "I've had people look at me like that my whole life. But you were wrong." "I know," he said quickly, his tone earnest now. "And I'm sorry for that. I really am." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to tell him off, to make him feel the way I'd felt that day. But another part of me, the part that had seen Mrs. Collins scared and vulnerable, the part that had stepped in when no one else would, knew that wouldn't change anything. "Apology accepted," I said finally, my voice steady. "Just, don't do it again. Not to me, not to anyone." He nodded, relief washing over his face. "You've got my word, kid." I started to walk away, but he called out after me. "Hey, for what it's worth, you did a good thing that day." I didn't turn around, but I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. "Yeah," I said quietly to myself. "I know." That evening, back at the apartment, I told Mom about the encounter. She listened quietly, her hands busy folding laundry but her eyes focused on me. "Do you think he meant it?" she asked when I finished. "I think so," I said. "And even if he didn't, it's not about him. It's about me. I know what I did, and I'm proud of it. That's enough." She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "That's my boy." Her words filled me with a warmth that I hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just surviving, I was standing tall, unshaken by the judgments of others. The morning of my first day at Crestwood Prep arrived far too quickly, and I spent most of it staring at myself in the mirror. The blazer they'd given me felt stiff, the tie even more so. It looked good, better than anything I'd ever worn, but it didn't feel like me. At least, not yet. "Stop fussing, Ty. You look great," Mom said from behind me, her voice laced with pride. She adjusted the collar of my shirt, stepping back to admire her work. "My son, all grown up and heading to the big leagues." I turned to her, swallowing the lump in my throat. "You think I'll fit in?" She smiled, her eyes soft but firm. "You don't need to fit in, Tyson. You're not like anyone else there, and that's a good thing." Her words stayed with me as I walked to the bus stop, my backpack slung over one shoulder. The ride to Crestwood felt like stepping into another world. The cracked sidewalks and faded storefronts of my neighborhood gave way to sprawling lawns, gated communities, and buildings that looked like they belonged in a movie. When the bus pulled up to the school gates, I felt my stomach twist. Crestwood Prep was enormous, with tall windows, ivy-covered walls, and a massive stone archway welcoming students. Kids in crisp uniforms moved in clusters, their voices carrying an easy confidence I couldn't imagine having. I adjusted my backpack, took a deep breath, and stepped off the bus. The first half of the day was a blur. The classrooms were smaller than I was used to, the teachers more attentive. They actually looked you in the eye when they talked to you, like they cared about whether or not you understood. It was overwhelming, but it was also exciting. During lunch, I found an empty bench outside and sat down, pulling out the sandwich Mom had packed for me. I was halfway through my first bite when a shadow fell across the table. "Mind if I sit here?" a familiar voice asked. I looked up to see Alex, the boy I'd met during my tour of the school. His friendly smile and easy posture made him look like he belonged here. Like he'd never doubted that he deserved it. "Sure," I said, sliding my bag over to make room. He sat down, unpacking his own lunch. "So, how's it going? First day treating you okay?" I shrugged, trying to sound casual. "It's different." "Good, though." He nodded, taking a bite of his sandwich. "Yeah, it's a lot at first. But you'll get the hang of it. If you need help with anything, classes, clubs, whatever, just let me know." His offer caught me off guard. I wasn't used to people looking out for me, especially people like Alex. "Thanks," I said, meaning it. We spent the rest of lunch talking about classes, teachers, and all the things Crestwood had to offer. For the first time, I started to think about what I could do here, not just survive, but thrive. That evening, as I sat at the kitchen table with my homework spread out in front of me, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: possibility. For so long, my life had been about getting by, about keeping my head above water. But now, for the first time, I could see a future that wasn't defined by struggle. Mom walked in from the kitchen, carrying 2 cups of tea. She set one down in front of me and ruffled my hair, a soft smile on her face. "How was it?" I smiled back, picking up the cup. "Good. Really good." She nodded, her eyes shining with pride. "I knew you'd be okay." As I looked around our tiny apartment, with its mismatched furniture and peeling wallpaper, I realized something. It didn't feel as small as it used to. It didn't feel like a trap. It felt like the place where everything had started, the place I would always carry with me, no matter how far I went.